Okay, these are the tools to take up the staples, the leftover staples and the tar paper. The hardwood, this is the chisels and hammer for the first pass are needed. These pry bars, special to jiggle the hardwood to separate it from the next row. Major crowbars to basically lift them completely off the subfloor. And this is a skill saw. If you need to, if you're not going to take off your baseboard of the around the wall, you'll need to cut using a skill saw. And then the oscillating saw to get into the corners. All right. Those. Okay. Set the depth of your skill saw to the thickness of your hardwood that you're going to cut into. So that's all set up. In this case, it's 3/4 inch hardwood, so we got 3/4. Okay, the skill saw, if you're not taking up the baseboard and you want to get around, you basically make a cut with the skill saw to the depth of the thickness of the boards themselves, the hardwood. And then to finish out the end, you use this oscillating tool to finish all the way to the end. Ready? Okay, if the baseboard is taken completely off, the hardwood, you don't have to do that previous step because once you take off the hardwood, it'll lift off automatically. If the baseboard goes underneath, you'll have to cut it. Otherwise, it's too hard to break. You'll break the tongue and the groove trying to slip it off from the one next to it. But if it goes all the way off, that last step could be eliminated and you get a longer piece if the baseboard is taken off. Okay, the first pass of taking off a row of hardwood is you drive chisels at various locations where you have a joint that's trying to keep it, on one on each side. All this step is doing is lifting up the staples for step number 1. So we're lifting up the staples by putting the chisels in and setting it up. The pry bar then will be placed in there, and we want to move it up and down enough to move the staple. And the whole process is we just want to get a separation, go from above, a little separation all the way down. So if you see over here, it's together. This whole first step, we're going to go down the entire row and just jiggle these boards a little bit just to get a little bit of separation. Will be kind of like the first pass. So we got chisels going down and kind of like jiggling it with this one bar or the larger bar, it doesn't matter, to basically get, and if you press down on it with your hand and press out, you'll avoid the tongue from coming up and breaking. So all we want is just a little bit of separation, and it's just a matter of moving all the chisels down. When you're done with it, get it in there. Moving it down. If you could see just a little bit of a separation, take the last chisel down, drive it in, pressing down on it so to avoid breaking the tongue. And we just want just a little bit of movement, a little separation. We will continue that all the way down the line. Okay, as you can see, we have just a little tiny gap all the way down for that row. So with the chisels and that pry bar, we have one small separation. All right, the next step. Ready? Okay, the next one, we're using the pry bar again, pressing down with our left hand to keep that from ruining the tongue, and it's just jiggling it. Get more of the handle. And sometimes you got to go back and forth. The whole purpose here is to get this gap wider than the tongue sticking out. So we want to get this board past that previous tongue. So it's a matter of getting it It's not a lot of force downward. It's not a lot of force upward. It's kind of like a jiggling action, but we want to press down. We're pushing down and out. And with that jiggling action, the staples are going. When you get to a joint, you don't want to have this one all the way out before the next board. We want the second one coming out kind of like uniform with the others. Again, you're pressing down with your one hand, bringing it up. Once that one's out a little bit, I can come back to this board and separating it. Right now that board is past the tongue, which is good. So now I got to get the next board. And you go right down the line, applying pressure to save the tongue. Again, with the board over here, you want a combination, and you bring it up. Now at this step, this board is now separated from the tongue, so we could lift that straight up. If you want to, you could jiggle a little bit more to try to get these staples a little higher, which will help protect the wood. Once we're past the tongue, so any upward force will not ruin the next row. And if you do it uniformly, we'll save the tongue and groove joint at the ends of each board. So you could lower. Okay. If you see how much this board has come up from the previous one, now the staples are barely in and you won't have much damage to the boards themselves. Okay. If you're doing with a friend, another co-worker, what you could do is one person will try to lift up the joint, basically having the one pry bar going away from the joint, this pry bar going away, and you just apply a little bit of pressure to get a little separation over there. This way, when I work on the back of the board and kind of come into it, I won't destroy that joint. If you're by yourself, you can get by with one, trying to center that in the middle. So both sides, the pry bar is getting both boards. You then come on the far end and you just gently, and if you want, you could jiggle it. Ideally, it comes out and you have a perfect board. The tongue, the groove, everything looks pretty good and it's in good shape. Notice the next one. Same thing, by yourself. One, if you had a partner, they would kind of like take both of those that way and kind of like lift up to get a little separation. If you're by yourself, you could do like that. Again, the main idea is to, when I start lifting up on the end, the far end over here, and prying it, this end will go down, and that basically protected from saving that tongue and groove over here. So I'll start on the far end. As we did before with the jiggling, sometimes you get a screw that's a little tight, but by jiggling it a little bit, allows it to separate. And again, notice that we have that tongue on this side, the groove, the whole bottom's in good shape, the whole top, the whole perimeter, everything is in great shape to use this board somewhere else. Longer boards, you could start without taking on the end, because it'll take a while before that board goes down on the end. Once you start getting close to the end, you could give that some support with your second bar. And just a matter. And again, that little jiggle, especially, and if it just comes out easy like that, you probably will have a board that's not even destroyed. The last one just comes straight out. All right. Once you go down there, once in a while, one of the staples will break through the tongue, and to remove it, a nice little claw tool, and just a matter of prying it and then just kind of like giving it kind of like a motion this way almost like a hammer motion, it'll pop right out. So sometimes they come out easy, sometimes not, but just a matter of just kind of like pulling that out and going. The other tools we use to take up the vapor barrier, in this case the tar paper, utility knife to cut it. And once you cut this whole length, you could then score those together. If you should have a staple that's really rough to get out, you can use channel locks to get that out. Especially if you happen to cut it on the end, channel locks work good. Then as far as the small staples that are holding down the vapor barrier, you could use just a regular flathead screwdriver, kind of like pop that up, and then with the pliers lift up the little small staples that are holding down, like in this case over here. We have a staple, just a matter of prying that up a little bit, grabbing your regular pliers and popping that little staple out. We'll set that. Okay, you ready? Okay, the first thing, make sure your surface is clear of anyone to protect the good side. You have a starter board over here that's clamped down. Then you could slip the other tongues into it, prevent motion moving. And what we want to do is to grind down the staples so that we have a nice piece left over. So again, make sure you have safety glasses on. You know, a mask are very important. What we're trying to do is to grind off the staples. Okay. You grind down the staples to make it as smooth as possible and try to just bring it in there. If you have some staples that went through the wood, you could grind these down a little bit to smooth out the wood, and we'll show you how to do that. You got this one? Okay, prior to doing that last step, to help out the person installing it, we basically have little red marks where the staples are. So on the top side, on the tongue, so whoever's installing it basically will see the location of the staples. And when they're driving a new staple on, they'll go to the side of it versus trying to hit where the staple actually was. Obviously on our new piece, we have over here the mark. The staple was ground down, but there's still little parts of that staple that are stuck in there. So if I'm driving it, I want to drive it to each side. That little red mark will help the installer not apply another staple on top of it. Or if this has to be cut, you don't want to cut through the staple because that'll ruin your blade. Okay, once you have all your boards cut, it's good to have them in lengths. So we go the longest to the shortest. And then over here, since we don't have much room, we all again go from the longest to the shortest. Have those all down there. If you happen to have some end pieces, then we want to keep those separated from the good boards. So notice on these boards themselves, these are good ones. You got a tongue on the end and a groove, plus the tongue and groove on each side. But if you had one that was cut, for instance this one, this is a groove end and the tongue end was cut. So what we want to do is we want to keep these separate, and what we'll do is we'll mark this one end, and this will be a groove end, so that if someone looks at that board, this one cannot be used anywhere except all the way against a wall. You don't want to butt an end. You want to make sure a tongue and a groove, if two boards are next to each other, each one has a tongue and a groove. So the ones with the tongue and groove on the end are prime pieces. The ones that are basically ends, you want to keep those separated. So on this one, these have the end with the tongue. And notice I have all these laid out over here. We also mark where the end is with N and T/E for the tongue end. So we have, this is the tongue and the end over here, and this is an end. So all these pieces in this big pile are basically tongue and end. This other stack goes a groove, okay, the one end is a groove. One end is a groove along with the end. So this is a groove with an end. And notice we have this stack has to be used for an end piece on one side. So when you're laying on a floor, you always want to start with one of these two end pieces, go all the way across, and then whatever you need to finish up, if they're all in assorted by length, you can then measure the last length you need, come and pick the one you want, and maybe have a very minimal amount of cut to save a lot on your waste. Reduce the weight. Okay, we have other stacks. It's nice to stack them according to lengths, and we have various piles. You could then use these as you're remodeling your room, adding on a new floor and everything else. And we have, and as you look over here, we have another set stack according to lengths and various lengths. This is a nice way to sort them and stack them, and